thank you for supplying water.
You're welcome.
Well, it's good to be with you. We're here to judge Unit 2. My name is Philip Crow. I recently retired after 35 years on the federal court, U.S. District Court here in Nevada. To my left.
I'm Nancy Lemke. I'm a deputy public defender in the Clark County Public Defender's Office.
I'm Sue Davis. I taught at Worcester High School for 7 years and was the Social Studies Program Coordinator for Washington County School District.
Hi, I'm Carol Ruthia. I worked for Judge Crow for many years, and now I work for another federal district judge.
And we'd be delighted if you would introduce yourself.
Nice to meet all of you. I'm Molly Maloney. Hi, I'm Josette Brixby.
Hello, I'm Nikki Beadle.
I'm Tyler Hart for Unit 2 from New York High School. Our teacher is Mr. Richard Clark, and our unit coach is Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mayer.
Great. Well, it's good to be with all of you, and nice to see so many family and fellow students here today. Unit 2 has 3 possible questions. We've selected one of them for your response today. We'll begin with a 4-minute prepared response, and then that will be followed by a 10-minute series of follow-up questions from the panel of judges. The question we have focused on is question number 3 in Unit 2. And I will read it to you at this time. It begins with a quote from Alexander Bickel. No society, certainly not a large and heterogeneous one, can fail in time to explode if it is deprived of the art of compromise, if it knows no ways of muddling through. No good society can be unprincipled, and no viable society can be principle-ridden. Do you agree or disagree with this opinion, and why? What evidence can you offer to support your response? What compromises were made at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and at what costs, and for what benefits? How would you distinguish between someone who is unprincipled and someone who is principle-ridden? What is the significance of those differences? You may begin.
It is not true that we are governed wholly by principle in some matters and wholly by expedient compromise in others. There is no such neat dividing line. Both requirements exist side by side, guiding principle and expedient compromise.
Professor Alexander Bickel expresses this throughout his work, The Least Dangerous Branch, by noting the polar nature of guiding principle, that is, political values or beliefs, and expedient compromise. One can sacrifice expediency or speed for their principles, becoming more principle-ridden, or one can sacrifice their principles for expediency, becoming unprincipled. However, Bickel notes that nothing is completely principle-ridden or unprincipled. There's a spectrum between these two terms which is open to much interpretation.
In this way, the terms principle-ridden and unprincipled are only applicable in the eye of the beholder. Many actions could be seen as principle-ridden from one perspective, but as unprincipled from another. During the 113th Congress, 98% of votes were directly among party lines. One may see this as principle-ridden, because representatives are so dedicated to their own party that they hardly ever vote against it. One may also see this as unprincipled, because many representatives vote against their own beliefs and principles in order to maintain their public image.
Whether our modern-day Congress is principle-ridden or unprincipled, it is certain that our representatives often have trouble compromising. This is why we agree with Bickel's opinion about the necessity of compromise. In October 2013, the government shut down because the two houses could not compromise over budget issues. Though not quite the explosion that Bickel wrote about, our government was not functional for 2 weeks because a compromise could not be reached.
Though many delegates had their own principles, the ability to compromise was their great strength at the Philadelphia Convention. The 3/5 clause in Article 1 formed an important alliance between slave state and non-slave state delegates. It counted slaves as 3/5 of a person. This gave slave states more representatives in the House and gave non-slave states more national tax revenue. However, the 3/5 clause, along with the importation clause in Article 1 and the fugitive slave clause in Article 4, validated slavery and deferred the abolition discussion to a much later time. The compromises regarding slavery helped get the Constitution ratified, but also cost hundreds of thousands of lives because of the horrors of slavery and the Civil War.
The other major compromise was regarding representation. James Madison's Virginia plan had proposed a bicameral legislature of proportional representation, while William Patterson's New Jersey plan had proposed a unicameral legislature of equal representation. The great compromise between these two plans formed our House of Representatives, proportional to population, and the Senate, in which representation was equal among all states. Today, one of the costs of the Great Compromise is that individual senators, through the process of a hold or the filibuster, can block major legislation.
Not all the delegates participated in these compromises. William Pierce from Georgia was unprincipled. He rarely spoke, rarely contradicted his fellow Georgians, and left the convention without even signing the Constitution. Luther Martin, a delegate from Maryland, was principle-ridden. He was so wedded to the inclusion of a Bill of Rights that he left before the convention ended. If all the delegates were like Pierce, we would have a structure for government that was good for nobody. If all the delegates were like Martin, we would have no structure for government at all.
It was those in the middle of Bickle's spectrum of principles who helped our large and heterogeneous society in the nascent years. Benjamin Franklin signed the Constitution even though the pro-slavery clauses contradicted his abolitionist principles. James Madison signed the Constitution and authored over a third of the Federalist Papers, even though the Great Compromise contradicted his belief in absolute majority rule. Delegates like these two knew that the country needed a constitution, even if it was imperfect, and thus helped the United States do more than just muddle through. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll begin with our follow-up questions now with my colleague to my left.
Excuse me. I want to hear you guys talk just a little bit more about the Great Compromise and why some of its provisions are still controversial today, if you would.
Well, the Great Compromise was between the representation plan in the Virginia plan, which was bicameral legislature, both based on population of a state, and then the New Jersey plan, which was modeled after the Articles of Confederation, which was equal representation based on every state.
To go back to the second part of my question, why do you think maybe some of those provisions are still controversial even today?
Some of these provisions can still be controversial because of proportional representation, which is under Article 1, Section 2 in the House of Representatives. And some people don't quite see this as fair because some of the larger they feel that there should be equal representation within all the states, such as Rhode Island, which is such a small state.
Also, it's very relevant today because even the two houses end up butting heads. As you can see with the Keystone Pipeline, although it has just recently been passed by both houses, originally the House of Representatives passed it and the Senate did not by one vote. And so this is very big because it shows that there's a big controversy between the two houses being proportional and one being equal.
To disagree with my colleague Molly, going back to James Madison's idea, he didn't like the Great Compromise because he thought that it rejected the idea of absolute majority rule. So having equality in the Senate doesn't give all the states the proportion that it needs.
Right. The Constitution, in the preamble, it says that we the people ordain it. So if we the people were truly ordaining it, then why is a whole House of Congress based solely around representing states? And even with the 17th Amendment, which led to direct election of senators rather than by state legislatures, there's still the controversy that really maybe it should be the people completely, no state representation in Congress.
Okay, looking at Locke's philosophy, evaluate the argument that equal representation of slaves ought to have been allowed because government is instituted to protect liberty, or property, sorry.
Well, this was an argument that was advanced by many Southern delegates, such as Charles Pinckney from South Carolina. But the Northern response to this at the convention was, well, if the South can count slaves for representation, then we should be able to count cattle. So you get into a very gray area when, like, I can start counting how many papers I have and give myself more votes for Congress when I turn 18. It's kind of ridiculous, at least in our day and age, and back then too.
It can also be seen as having principles because they were able to come to a compromise with the property. Slaves were counted as property, and so thus through the Fugitive Slave Clause and 3/5 Clause, they were able to count them as 3/5 of a person so that there's some balance between the two by recognizing property and recognizing the citizens who were free.
This can be also seen in Article 7, which sets the ratification process for the Constitution. The people were supposed to elect electors to go to these special conventions to then ratify the Constitution. It was meant to represent the people. However, women, African-American slaves were not represented.
Sure.
The question refers to the art of compromise. Do you think it's an art, and why or why not?
The art of compromise is definitely important, and I think one major issue we see in our Congress today is that they won't even understand that there is even the word compromise. This can be seen with Speaker of the House John Boehner when he was first elected. He made the comment in an interview, "I will not compromise, I reject the word compromise." And the fact that he doesn't even think that compromise matters, or that instead of compromise they should find a common ground, is a really big issue when just trying to figure out the best way to make a bill.
Art is a compromise because it's making so someone has to sacrifice their personal beliefs in order for the well-being of others, such as the common good. In Congress, senators are often, they have to sacrifice their own personal beliefs to reach a verdict which is better for the common good of the United States as a whole.
I think also the art of compromise has really shifted from the Philadelphia Convention to today's Congress. We see things like log rolling in Congress. So one representative or one party will vote for another party's bill in return for their votes, or for their bill to be passed. So that isn't really compromising, that's just you want your bill to be passed. So.
American society in 1787 was, I think by most definitions, heterogeneous to a degree. Parts of it weren't included. Females weren't accorded the right to suffrage. Those who were African American slaves were certainly not incorporated in a meaningful way. Today, do you think we remain a heterogeneous society, or even a greater degree of heterogeneous nature in our society? And how does that impact the ability to compromise our members of Congress or others?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, it's important to note that when the Philadelphia Convention was going on, it's a little bit unrealistic to think that African Americans and women would be represented, just because a lot of African Americans were just thought of as property. So in that sense, in that time period, the people that were being represented, the framers and people at the ratification conventions thought that they were representing most of the people, or at least the people they believed that mattered and could influence the society. So in that sense, yes, today we are heterogeneous, because compared to back then, they believed that that was a heterogeneous society.
I think this impacts Congress's decision-making abilities because there's many different viewpoints that need to be taken into account. And unfortunately, in psychology, there's this concept called groupthink, where in Federalist 10, James Madison wrote that when you put a bunch of different people together, what you end up having is a filtering of the opinion. But what actually happens is when you group people together, they don't mediate their opinion. They polarize them. So what ends up happening is hundreds and hundreds, different ideas are being represented in Congress, which decreases the compromise. So it becomes even more important because our society is more heterogeneous.
And going back to the first part of your question, there are still people today who are not being represented, such as felons and illegal immigrants. They don't have the right to vote, and they can't participate in government.
Why do you think it is so difficult today for Americans to compromise over some of our major public issues? And what do you think can be done to rectify this?
To answer the first part of your question, I think it comes down to whether Congress sees these issues as necessary to compromise. At the Philadelphia Convention, they knew that compromise was necessary. They were forming a structure of government that has well served us over 200 years. And this is compared with today, where Congress sees issues such as immigration, where if they would have seen it as necessary, they would have compromised previous to President Obama's executive order on immigration.
To address the second part of your question, a way that compromise can be better reached is if we had a secrecy rule, such as the delegates of the Philadelphia Convention had. This would be very beneficial, because then the congressmen and women wouldn't be obligated to vote on their certain party lines. They'd be more free to speak to one another and express their viewpoints instead of always being responsible to their different parties.
Another way we can do this is actually an internal check that the Senate has, and this would speed up the art of compromise, which would be for them to vote on their rule of filibustering, and instead of having it be a supermajority of people to end a filibuster, it could be a majority of people, and this could just end up speeding along the process of compromising instead of wasting time.
Okay, unintended consequences is a term historians use quite frequently. So what were some unintended consequences as a result of the compromises made during the Constitutional Convention?
Well, I think unfortunately the biggest one was the Civil War. Elbridge Gerry at the convention, he wrote to a friend, he said, "I am exceedingly distressed at the proceedings of the convention, being sure that they laid the foundation for a civil war." And what happened was that the framers thought that slavery was on the decline, and so in Article 1, Section 9, they said that the slave trade was going to be protected until 1808. But as is common to say, the framers couldn't fathom the technology that was going to be developed. And this was true even in 1794 when the cotton gin was developed, and this increased the number of, the profitability of slavery, and so protecting the slave industry till 1808 made hundreds of thousands of more slaves being shipped to the United States, and increased the North-South divide, which led to the Civil War.
One thing that framers could not possibly, or maybe wouldn't have imagined, is our modern today Congress, and the fact that the 112th Congress only passed about 500 bills, which is less than the Do-Nothing Congress, who passed about 800. And their whole idea was making a function of government to create compromise to actually run, and if they're only making a certain amount of bills, well, maybe it's not running correctly as it should have been when they were first making it.
Perfect timing. We have just a brief opportunity to give some feedback. I enjoyed your presentation very much, and I thought it was very well organized. I liked the point that was made quite early on the